hello. Welcome back, everybody. I know it's been a little while. Welcome back to Exodus Brothers. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. It's a little bit heavier, a little more personal, and it's long overdue. We're tackling the subject of James Dobson and Focus on the Family. We're doing this because James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, has just passed away just recently. For many of us, maybe for you listening right now, Dobson was a very negative influence on our culture. His voice filled our homes, not as comfort, but as control. His books sat on our shelves like law. His ideas reached deep into our families, our churches, our schools, and our politics. And now that he's gone, we're left with the question, what do we do with his legacy? Are we supposed to mourn him? Do we critique him? Do we just stay silent and move on? I want to start here. I don't celebrate death. I don't think that's what healing looks like, frankly. But I also don't believe in lying. The truth is this. James Dobson's life work caused enormous harm. His focus on the family, quote unquote, left millions of people disconnected from their true selves, trapped in cycles of shame, and wounded in ways that take a lifetime to recover from. So this episode isn't about Dobson's death, it's about our lives now. About the way his empire shaped us, and about the way we move forward, freer, lighter, and maybe finally a bit more honest. All right, we're going to talk about the evangelical world. So to understand Dobson, you have to understand the moment that he rose. America in the 1960s and 70s was changing very fast. The sexual revolution had challenged traditional views of marriage and sex. Feminism was gaining ground. Women were entering the workforce, demanding equal pay, and fighting for reproductive rights. The civil rights movement had forced the church to confront its silence on racism. And by the mid-1970s, Roe v. Wade had legalized abortion nationwide. For conservative evangelicals, this was a crisis. They felt the culture slipping away. They needed leaders and figureheads, people who could rally the troops and give them both spiritual and political direction. Enter James Dobson. Unlike the typical firebrand preacher or politician, Dobson came wrapped in credibility. He wasn't necessarily thundering from a pulpit. He was speaking calmly like a doctor. He used psychology, statistics, quote-unquote family values language. But behind that calm tone was the same fear. America was under attack, and the family was the battlefield. For many of us, Dobson wasn't a distant public figure. He was in our homes. His radio show aired daily. Parents tuned in while driving to work. Kids overheard it in the back seat. His books like Dare to Discipline, The Strong-Willed Child, and Love Must Be Tough sat on bedside tables. Magazines arrived in the mail with smiling families on the cover, promising guidance for godly living. Think about that. Most politicians, even the famous ones, don't have that kind of reach. But Dobson did. He wasn't just shaping public policy, he was shaping bedtime routines, dinner table conversations, how kids were punished after school, and so on. That's the power of Focus on the Family. It wasn't abstract, it was intimate. It crawled right into the most private spaces of life and told you, here's how you raise your kids, here's how you treat your spouse, and here's how you vote. It had a massive influence on Christian families, especially growing up in the 90s. Now, here's why his death matters. When someone like James Dobson dies, it's not just a news headline, it's a trigger for most of us. It stirs up memories, both good and bad. Some people were posting tributes, calling him a defender of the family, a moral voice in chaotic times. And others, maybe people like us, will feel something more complicated. A mix of grief, relief, maybe even anger. Because we know firsthand what his teachings did. We know the bruises, literal and metaphorical, that came from his words. We know the weight of purity culture, the fear of God as an angry parent, the shame heaped on LGBTQ kids, and the suffocation of women told to stay small. It's complicated to process when someone dies who shaped your trauma. On one hand, you feel the instinct to respect the dead. On the other, you feel the need to finally, honestly, speak truth about their harm. That tension, that's what we're here to talk about today. All right, so first I'm going to walk through Dobson's rise, his beginnings, his books, the creation of Focus on the Family, and how it exploded into a cultural empire. Then we'll dig into the damage. And I won't rush this part, because we need to name it clearly. The harm to children, to LGBTQ people, to women, and to families as a whole Each one deserves its own careful attention. After that, we'll step back and look at the political machine he built, how he helped forge the religious right, how his fingerprints are still all over American politics today. And finally, we'll land in the hardest but most important part. What now? What do we do with his legacy? How do we grieve, process, and heal after a lifetime under the shadow of James Dobson? If something I say stirs up old pain, pause the episode, take a breath, come back later. Because I know this isn't just history. It's lived experience. It's the stuff many of us are still unpacking in therapy, in conversations with our friends, and deconstruction spaces like this. One last thing before we move on. Some might wonder, why dredge all this up? Dobson is gone, right? Why not just move on? The answer is because his ideas are not gone. Focus on the Family is still alive and well. They're still publishing, still broadcasting, still lobbying. And even outside that organization, Dobson's DNA runs through evangelicalism. The parenting methods, the purity culture, the political alignment, it's all still here, and he is directly responsible for a lot of it. So telling the story isn't about attacking a dead man. It's about understanding how his life's work continues to echo in ours today. And it's about reclaiming our narratives from his shadow. So let's dive in. Let's rewind to the 1960s and 70s when America was in cultural upheaval, and a young psychologist named James Dobson decided that the future of the nation would be won or lost in the family living room. So let's go back. James Dobson was born in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1936. His father was a Nazarene pastor, and like many of us who grew up in the church, his childhood was saturated in faith. But unlike the kids who went on to become pastors or missionaries, Dobson took a different route. He went into psychology. He earned his PhD in child development at USC, taught at the medical school, and even served on staff at a children's hospital. That professional background is what gave him his edge. He wasn't Pastor James Dobson. He was Dr. James Dobson. And in an evangelical culture that often mistrusted secular science, he was the rare bridge. A man who claimed the authority of psychology, but who interpreted it entirely through the lens of evangelical Christianity. They had someone to fight for them. In 1970, Dobson published the book that would launch his career, Dare to Discipline. This wasn't just another parenting guide, it was a manifesto. Dobson argued that children are naturally rebellious, that their wills must be broken, and that corporal punishment, which included spanking and hitting, was a necessary tool. He reassured parents not to be afraid of causing pain so long as it didn't leave a mark. This book exploded. For evangelical parents, it gave a sense of certainty in an uncertain cultural moment. The 60s had brought the sexual revolution, the rise of feminism, and challenges to authority. Parents felt threatened, and here was a book telling them, you're right to be worried. Your kids are under attack, and the way to save them is to discipline them harder with God's approval. It's hard to overstate how widely Dare to Discipline spread. It sold millions of copies. Pastors quoted it from pulpits. Christian schools adopted its methods. Homeschool families made it their handbook. For an entire generation, it became the parenting Bible. 7 years later, in 1977, Dobson took the next step. He founded Focus on the Family. At first, it was a small radio broadcast recorded in Arcadia, California. But Dobson was a gifted communicator. Clear, calm, authoritative. He sounded less like a firebrand preacher and more like a trusted neighbor giving advice. Parents tuned in, and quickly the audience grew. By the 1980s, Focus had expanded far beyond a radio show. It became a full-blown media empire. This consisted of magazines like Focus on the Family and Clubhouse for Kids, books on parenting, marriage, discipline, sexuality, and dating, cassette tapes and VHS videos mailed directly to homes, hotlines and counseling services where parents could call for advice, conferences and seminars drawing thousands at a time. And perhaps most significantly, in 1991, Dobson moved the entire operation from California to Colorado Springs, Colorado. That move transformed Colorado Springs into the unofficial headquarters of evangelical political activism. To this day, the city is home to dozens of conservative Christian organizations, all drawn there in part because Dobson planted his flag. What set Dobson apart was how quickly he blurred the lines between family life and politics. Most parenting experts stick to bedtime routines, school struggles, communication tips, and so on. But Dobson went further. He told parents, The way you raise your kids is part of a larger war. If you don't discipline your children, feminism will destroy the home. If you don't guard your family, secularism will take over America. If you don't vote the right way, abortion and homosexuality will ruin the nation. In other words, your living room is a battlefield. That message resonated deeply. Evangelical parents weren't just raising children. They were saving America. Every spanking, every withheld privilege, every restriction on TV or music wasn't just parenting, it was spiritual warfare. For those of us who grew up in this world, Dobson wasn't an abstract figure. He was there. Maybe you remember your parents quoting him. Dr. Dobson says, ... Maybe you remember his books on the shelves. The Strong-Willed Child, Love Must Be Tough, and so on. Maybe you overheard his radio show in the car, the calm, steady voice talking about discipline, marriage, purity, family values. That was his genius and his danger. He wasn't a politician you could tune out. He wasn't a pastor you could avoid by skipping church. He was everywhere. The voice in the background of daily life. The authority that seemed impossible to question because he wasn't just giving opinions, he was giving God's blueprint for family. By the late 80s and early 90s, Focus on the Family was massive. At its peak, the radio show aired on over 7,000 stations worldwide, reaching an audience of over 200 million people. The organization employed thousands. They had a sprawling campus in Colorado Springs that became a pilgrimage site for evangelical families. And with that kind of influence, Dobson wasn't just shaping families, he was shaping culture. Politicians sought his approval, presidents courted his endorsement, entire organizations spun off from Focus on the Family, like the Family Research Council, which became one of the most powerful lobbying groups in Washington. What began as a parenting book had grown into one of the most influential political and religious machines in modern American history. And at the heart of it all was the same message: the family is under attack, and James Dobson has the answers. So let's talk about the most personal and immediate impact of Dobson's teachings: the harm to kids. Because for all the politics, all the lobbying, all the books and radio broadcasts, at its core, Dobson's message was about controlling children. The theology of discipline. Dobson's philosophy boiled down to this: children are sinful from birth. Their natural instincts are rebellion, and the role of the parent is to break their will. He often used the phrase strong-willed child, describing kids who resisted authority. To him, this wasn't just personality, it was sin, and the solution was force. In Dare to Discipline, he told parents to spank children hard enough to cause pain. He advised using objects like belts or paddles, and he warned parents not to be swayed by tears. In one infamous passage, he described spanking his own dog with a belt until it submitted, then said the same principles applied to raising children. Think about that for a second. That was the framework Dobson gave to millions of parents. For kids growing up under his teaching, home wasn't a safe place, it was a battlefield. Love became conditional. Affection was something you earned through obedience. God himself became associated with punishment, because Dobson constantly tied discipline to spirituality. Parents weren't just correcting kids, they were saving their souls. I've heard countless stories, from listeners and followers, friends, family, and maybe you have too, of kids who learned to flinch at the sound of their father's belt being taken off. Kids who hid in their rooms, bracing themselves for the blows. Kids who grew up believing that pain was proof of love. And for many, that didn't stop at childhood. It carried into adulthood. Into anxiety, depression, broken relationships, fear of intimacy, and difficulty trusting others. What makes this all even more tragic is that Dobson claimed to be a psychologist. He wore that credential like a badge of credibility, but his teachings flew in the face of decades of research on child development. Modern psychology is clear. Corporal punishment does not create healthier kids. It increases aggression. It fuels anxiety and depression. It damages trust between parent and child. Children raised under authoritarian discipline are more likely to struggle with self-esteem, more likely to hide problems, and more likely to develop unhealthy coping mechanisms. In other words, the exact opposite of what Dobson promised. Dobson's influence didn't stop at the family home. His teachings bled into Christian schools, where corporal punishment was often normalized. They bled into homeschooling communities, much like Jake and I were raised in, where Dare to Discipline was treated as gospel. They shaped entire generations of pastors, teachers, and parents who believed that spare the rod, spoil the child was not just a proverb, but a command. The result was a culture where abuse was normalized, where kids didn't even have the language to call it abuse because everyone around them said it was love. And the ripple effects went even further into how these kids grew up and parented their own children. For some, the cycle repeated. For others, it took years of therapy, deconstruction, and courage to break free. Beyond the physical and emotional harm, Dobson's teachings left deep spiritual wounds. If you grew up with this, you know what I mean. God was presented as a disciplinarian, ready to punish. Faith wasn't about love or grace, it was about obedience and fear. For many, that made church feel unbearable. Prayer became triggering, scriptures about discipline felt like weapons. The idea of God as a loving parent felt foreign because the model of parent you grew up with was control, punishment, and pain. So, let's name it clearly. Dobson's teachings created trauma, not discipline. Not quote-unquote tough love, trauma. And the first step in healing is being able to say that out loud, to stop minimizing it, to stop excusing, to stop saying, well, it was a different time. No, it was wrong then, and it's wrong now. And millions of us are still working through the aftermath. If Dobson had stopped at discipline, maybe his impact would have stayed within families. But he didn't. His influence spilled outward, and nowhere is that more obvious than his war on LGBTQ people. From the 1980s onward, Focus on the Family was one of the loudest and most powerful voices against gay rights in America. Dobson cast queerness not as identity, not as love, not as humanity, but as a threat, a sickness, a corruption of God's design. Most notably, we see this with conversion therapy. Dobson didn't just oppose same-sex marriage. He actively promoted conversion therapy, the idea that sexual orientation could be changed through prayer, counseling, and discipline. Focus on the Family created entire ministries dedicated to this. They partner with Exodus International, a network of ex-gay programs that promise to heal people of same-sex attraction. They hosted conferences, published testimonies, and funded counseling centers. And it wasn't just adults. Teens were sent into these programs, sometimes willingly, oftentimes, though, forced by their parents. We now know the devastating results. Survivors describe years of shame, depression, and suicidal thoughts. Many never made it out. The American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, and countless medical bodies have condemned conversion therapy as harmful and ineffective. But Dobson's machine poured millions into keeping it alive, and it still is today. Dobson also waged political war. Focus on the Family spent huge resources fighting against LGBTQ rights at every level. They opposed anti-discrimination laws that would have protected gay and trans people in housing and employment. They fought sex education programs that taught inclusivity. They lobbied against marriage equality, both in the courts and through state ballot initiatives. They helped fuel the Defense of Marriage Act in the 1990s, which federally defined marriage as between a man and a woman. For Dobson, this wasn't just politics, it was salvation. He framed LGBTQ rights as an existential threat to the family, to the church, and to the nation itself. But beyond the policy fights, the deepest damage was personal. Imagine being a queer kid, growing up in an evangelical household, tuned into Dobson every day. Imagine hearing over and over again, your identity is sinful, your love is broken, your very existence is dangerous. Many queer kids grew up hiding. Some tried to change themselves. Some entered conversion therapy. Some were kicked out of their homes. And tragically, some didn't survive. That is the human cost of Dobson's war. Not abstract, not theoretical, real lives and real pain. Real people hurt. Even now, Focus on the Family is heavily involved in anti-LGBTQ lobbying. They've of course shifted language, using religious freedom as a new umbrella term, but the DNA hasn't changed. And the rhetoric that Dobson popularized, that queer people are threats to children, that same-sex marriage destroys society, is still being recycled today by politicians, pastors, and media outlets. So, let's name it clearly. Dobson's teachings about LGBTQ people were harmful. They fueled shame. They destroyed families and cost lives. And for those of us who grew up in queer evangelical households, we're still untangling the damage. Some of us are still learning to believe we're lovable. Some of us are still healing from the closets we were forced into. Some of us are still reclaiming our faith, our bodies, and our sense of safety. Another central piece of Dobson's message was gender. He believed men and women were created with rigid, divinely assigned roles. And in his world, those roles were not equal. How he saw it? Men lead and women submit. Dobson preached a traditional patriarchal model of family. Men were to lead, provide, and protect. Women were to submit, nurture, and to follow. Any deviation from this design was rebellion against God himself. He wrote extensively about wives needing to respect their husbands, about men needing to stand strong as leaders, and he often minimized the struggles women faced. For example, Dobson frequently told women in difficult marriages to remain faithful, even in cases of emotional neglect or abuse. Divorce, he taught, was a last resort, rarely acceptable. The weight of maintaining the family often fell squarely on a woman's shoulders, no matter the cost to their safety or mental health. Dobson also fueled what would later become known as purity culture. He emphasized sexual abstinence before marriage, strict dating boundaries, and modest rules for girls. He framed sex as dangerous outside of marriage and almost magical within it, a combination that left many young people confused, ashamed, or deeply repressed. Girls especially bore the brunt of this message. They were told to be modest, to guard their brothers from temptation, to equate their worth with their sexual purity. And if they slipped, even once, they were told they were damaged goods. Imagine the toll this had on many women, hearing this message growing up. The impact was suffocating. Women who dreamed of careers were told they were selfish. Women who left abusive husbands were told they lacked faith. Women who expressed anger or independence were labeled rebellious. Entire generations of daughters were raised to shrink themselves, while sons were raised to see leadership as entitlement. The result was households where equality was impossible, where women's voices were silenced, where girls grew up without seeing their full potential honored. Dobson wasn't just talking about the home. He tied gender roles to national survival. Feminism, in his view, was a threat to the family and to America. That's why he opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. That's why he railed against women in leadership. For Dobson, traditional gender roles weren't just personal preference, they were a divine mandate, and questioning them meant questioning God. So again, let's be clear. Dobson's teachings on gender harmed women. They trapped women in abusive marriages, they denied women autonomy, they shamed girls into silence, and many of us are still carrying the residue, learning how to reclaim our voices, our choices, and our freedom outside of that framework. By the 1990s, Dobson wasn't just a family advisor, he was a political kingmaker. Dobson was one of the architects of the modern religious right, the coalition of evangelical leaders who turned conservative Christians into a powerful voting bloc. Alongside figures like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, Dobson mobilized millions of evangelicals into politics. But, unlike Falwell or Robertson, Dobson's focus wasn't preaching or televangelism. His focus was the family. He convinced ordinary parents that their private lives were tied to public policy. If you loved your kids, you had to fight against abortion, against gay rights, and against feminism. This was his genius, making politics feel like parenting. Dobson had the ear of presidents. Ronald Reagan praised him. George W. Bush consulted him. Senators and congressmen sought his endorsement. Through Focus on the Family and affiliated organizations like the Family Research Council, Dobson poured millions into lobbying. They fought against abortion rights, opposed sex education, and backed conservative judicial appointments. In fact, some of the Supreme Court decisions we live with today on reproductive rights and marriage equality were influenced by the groundwork Dobson helped lay. As you can see here, the early beginnings of Christian nationalism, which we'll talk about in a separate episode of its own. Dobson's political machine shaped not just evangelical culture, but American culture at large. The polarization we see today, the way politics is framed as a moral and spiritual battle, owes much to the foundation Dobson built. When you hear politicians talk about family values, quote unquote, that's Dobson's language. When you see evangelical voters treated as a monolithic conservative bloc, that's Dobson's legacy. And the damage was immense. Laws were passed that restricted women's health care. LGBTQ rights were blocked for decades. Entire elections swung on the rhetoric Dobson popularized. It wasn't just family advice anymore. It was national policy, and it shaped the trajectory of America for half a century. So, here we are now. Dobson has passed away. Focus on the Family still exists, but his voice is gone. What do we do with the legacy he left behind? First, we have to name it. We have to be honest about what his teachings were and what they did. They were not quote-unquote traditional values. They were not quote-unquote godly parenting. They were authoritarian, manipulative, and harmful. They normalized abuse, they fueled homophobia, they silenced women, they distorted the image of God into something violent and controlling. Naming it isn't bitterness, it's clarity. We have to grieve it. Because for many of us, Dobson's influence took something precious. Safe childhoods, loving families, a sense of self. For some, even their faith. Grief means acknowledging what was lost. It means giving ourselves permission to mourn the years we spent under his shadow. It means admitting we deserve better. Third, we reclaim family. Family doesn't have to mean authoritarian fathers and submissive mothers. It doesn't have to mean closets for queer kids and belts for strong-willed children. Family can mean chosen family. Friends who become siblings, communities that feel like home. It can mean marriages built on equality and love, not hierarchy. It can mean parenting that centers empathy, respect, and trust. We get to redefine family on our own terms, free from Dobson's blueprint. Fourth, we find better voices. Therapists, writers, theologians, communities, deconstruction zones like this. People who speak a different language. A language of grace, empathy, and freedom. People who tell us that love does not mean pain, that God does not mean punishment, and that family does not mean fear, but love. So as we close this episode today, which was a bit of a different structure than previous episodes, but we hope you enjoyed it. As we close, I want to come back to the moment we're in. James Dobson has died. And that fact brings up complicated emotions. Relief for some, anger for others, maybe even sadness, maybe guilt for feeling relief. All of that is normal. When someone dies who shaped your trauma, there's no clean way to process it. But here's what I want you to know. You don't have to carry his legacy anymore. You don't have to honor it. You don't have to forgive it. You don't have to pretend it was good. You get to tell the truth. You get to grieve. You get to heal. James Dobson shaped generations, but his story doesn't get the last word. We do. Thanks, everyone. This has been Exodus Brothers. Thanks for listening. And if you're someone still untangling the impact of Dobson and focus on the family, know this. You're not alone. Your pain is real. Your healing is possible. And together we can build something better.